So you're going to notice today that my screen's a little bit different. We have a bunch of icons on it. Well, I'm not doing my classic virtualization video. Well, this is virtualize everything. So this will be leading up to virtualizing some stuff. But we're going to start doing a little bit of work with the Raspberry Pi. So I wanted to film a install video for the Raspberry Pi. We're going to be installing Raspberry Pi OS today. So in order to get the Raspberry Pi OS, we're first going to go to raspberrypi.org/downloads. And you see you have two options here. We're going to pick the Raspberry Pi OS button. As you can see, it was previously called Rasparian, and we're going to download the light version. So there's a couple of different versions here, as you can see. There's one with desktop and recommended software. There's one with just the desktop, and then there's a light version. The light version is the command line, quote-unquote, server version of Raspberry Pi OS. It's going to be a perfect operating system to install software like Docker so we can virtualize applications later on in future videos. So you're going to select that, and you can either download via a torrent or download via a zip. We'll click download, and you notice it starts downloading. So it just says it's going to take about a minute to download. So this is what we get. We get a zip. We're going to unpack it. So on a Mac, we're just going to double click. And we'll throw that zip out because we no longer need it. There you go. There's the light version, the newest version of Raspberry Pi OS Lite. So now you'll notice we're going to have this WPA supplicant.conf file, and we're going to have an SSH file. I also have Atom and this other icon here. We'll be using this later on as our application to SSH into the Raspberry Pi. You don't need this on a Mac. You can use the terminal. This is just kind of a little bit easier. It saves configurations and stuff. But to go back to what we were doing, we need to now unpack the image onto the SD card. We're going to use Etcher to do that. And this is pretty straightforward, actually. So we'll drag the image here. Then we're going to drag the SD card here. Oh, we have to select it in this new version. We'll select it, and we press flash. Enter our system password. Okay, now that that's finished validating, you'll notice that Etcher already unmounts the SD card when it's finished. You're going to remove the SD card from the slot and reinsert it. Now, if everything goes as planned, when you reinsert it, you'll get an icon that it shows up that's called boot. That boot, you're going to open the SD card, and we're going to insert one or two files depending on what you're trying to do. The first one is going to be this SSH file. Now, this file contains absolutely nothing, as you can see here, and it has no dot anything after it. What this file does is it activates the SSH feature inside of Raspberry Pi OS. Now, that is important because otherwise, to turn on SSH, we would have to set up a monitor, a mouse, a keyboard, and we don't want to do that because we want to run this headless. So that's how we activate SSH. Now, if you're using your Ethernet port, assuming that you have a new Raspberry Pi 4 or the 3B Plus or B or any of those other than the Raspberry Pi Zero, you can just use that and plug your Ethernet cord in. Now, the other file we have here is if you want to use your Wi-Fi, there is actually a way to put a file into this same boot directory called wpssupplicant.conf. Now, your country may vary. This stays the same. Your network SSID is entered right here, and your PSK is entered right here. And this is your encryption type. Now, if you were to fill this file out, which we're not going to do today because I plan on using my Ethernet port to set all of this up, but if you were to fill this out and enter it in here and just drag it over, just like I did with the SSH file right in here and let it go, that would set up your Wi-Fi configuration. So on your first boot, your Raspberry Pi would actually connect to Wi-Fi without any other configuration. Now, I'm done because that's what we're at. So we're just going to go ahead and eject boot. Now with boot ejected, I'm going to insert my micro SD card into the micro SD slot on my Raspberry Pi, and at this point we can plug the Raspberry Pi in to power and Ethernet, and it's going to go ahead and boot up. Now, there are a number of different ways that you can set up or identify your IP address for your newly booted Raspberry Pi. I'm not going to cover them, but basically, most of the time, you want to log into your wireless router or your router period, you're all in one unit, and look at your settings to get your IP address. Now, there's other ways to do it, like running an Nmap scan of your network, but the IP address for my particular Raspberry Pi is going to be 10.10.2.45. Now that's important. Let's remember it for a second. So we're going to open this application and we're going to click New Host, and we can call it whatever. We'll call it Test today. The address, the IP address that we talked about is going to be 10.10.2.45. Don't need to worry about group. Don't need to worry about tags. Default SSH port is 22. Username is going to be Pi. Password is going to be Raspberry. And we can hit save. And we should now be able to establish an SSH connection into the Raspberry Pi. Now, this concludes my video today of installing Raspberry Pi OS onto a Raspberry Pi. But there are some steps that you probably want to take after this, which I'm going to show you in my next video. And I would also like to make an announcement. If we can hit 1,000 subscribers by January 1st, we're going to give away one 8-gig Raspberry Pi 4 to a lucky viewer that has liked and subscribed to the Virtualize Everything channel. Hope you enjoyed this video. Have a good night.